But let's start with the GDPR refresher by Walter van Holst.
Thank you, Aniek. By the way, I already knew that doing a GDPR refresher in 15 minutes would probably be too ambitious anyway. And to add to that, feel free to raise your hand during the coming 15 minutes and ask questions, and I'll try to the best of my abilities to answer them. But especially since we are all just had lunch, things may get more sleepy, and therefore it's extra useful to keep it slightly interactive. Yeah, Nick already introduced let's move to the substance. Basically, what I want to do is sort of this is the introduction. Just do a small step back and go back to the origins of data protection law. One of the misunderstandings about it is it's a very European thing. It's not. And I want then move into the core principles and then hop to the bits that talk about privacy by design and by security, because that to me is the closest connection to cryptography in the GDPR itself. But yeah, first on the origins. That's actually the US Nixon administration. Nixon is famous for other things than data protection. I would say the Environmental Protection Agency is one of his great successes, and only Nixon could go to China, but there was also Nixon that gave us data protection. Well, it was self-regulation at the time, but in 1973, there was the Code of Fair Information Practices that got written down by a committee under his administration, and I just in verbatim copied those 5 principles. It's not like they are exactly like that in the GDPR, but people who have some familiarity with data protection laws will just recognize that a lot of what we try to achieve with data protection law is already embodied in these 5 abstract, but nonetheless accessible principles. And that also makes it funny for those who feel from the other side of the Atlantic that the Europeans are kind of imposing their data protection laws on the US. It's a brainchild of the Americans. Not entirely. At the same time, elsewhere in the world, there were data protection laws coming into being, and basically the big driver was political unease about the introduction of basically mainframes and the first mass processing of personal data, and also with the memories of the totalitarian horrors of World War II and also of other ideologies in mind. There was a sensitivity about large amounts of data, and the fear was mostly about governments and large corporations. So in that sense, little has changed as well. If we move a little bit further forward, then indeed it becomes more of a European thing. The Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Union, kind of saw that there was a great disparity of data protection laws across Europe, and kind of an additional convention on top of the European Convention of Human Rights. This is called Convention 108, codified in a treaty data protection law. And by the way, Convention 108 has quite a few members outside the Council of Europe. There's plenty of countries in the global south that have joined Convention 108. Even Russia used to be a signatory of Convention 108. I'm not entirely sure that Russia would count as a country with strong data protection, but still, on paper it was. And then we move another decade forward, and then the European Union, which has the single market, or back then it was called the common market, as one of their goals, noted that there were all sorts of internal barriers between European countries, between member states, on the transfer of data, because of, again, different implementations in national law of Convention 108. And it had become a trade barrier within Europe. And that resulted in the Data Protection Directive, which was the predecessor of the GDPR. And that's how we ended up with the GDPR in 2018. But in terms of how new data protection is, basically we're already more than half a century down this particular trip. I should also mention that partly due to Convention 108, partly due to the sort of inspiration provided, especially by the directive, countries like Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, Japan, all the members of the African Union do have data protection laws on the books with very strong similarities to these frameworks. I would even go as far as saying that HIPAA in the US, Nick already mentioned it, oh, I have 10 minutes left, good, is actually quite compatible in its thinking, but it's much more prescriptive than the European principle-based regulation. And that is actually the harder part about the GDPR. It's very principle-based, and you have to translate these abstract principles to your concrete use cases, so it always depends. That will be a recurring theme in this conversation. Well, to go back to the core principles, there's this notion of lawfulness, and that notion of lawfulness already gets a bit separated in you must have a lawful basis, and you must not contravene a prohibition in law. So there's a positive and a negative lawfulness aspect to it. But in some sense, the GDPR is a bit of a recursive thing because lawful appears multiple times in the text. There's notions of transparency, correctness, and maintaining integrity and confidentiality. That's again a hook towards information security. And your data processing must be proportionate and limited to specific purposes. And there must be a case of data minimization. And I'm going to zoom in a bit further on this, or actually zoom out. But fear not, we have the zoom function. At least I hope it works now. Yes. For example, if you go to the lawful basis, everyone is always talking about consent. Well, first of all, consent is just one of 6 lawful bases, and that consent must be demonstrable, distinguishable, it must be withdrawable, it must be specific, it must be well informed and freely given. If you, for example, apply this to ad tech with online tracking and advertising, and you run into trouble with this basis. Well, you run into trouble with many bases, but especially to, let's say, the outside observer that always thinks it's about consent, that consent means something very specifically in this context, and there's a pretty high bar to clear. And also the bad news is, if you do not have a basis for processing in the GDPR, secure multi-party computation is not going to provide you for it. But there are aspects, like, for example, in one of the other bases, where you have the legitimate interest of the data controller, the one who basically decides the means and the purposes of the data processing. That is a balancing act. And part of the balancing act is how, to what extent your data processing could negatively impact the people about the data you're, who are the subjects of the data, or basically who could be identified directly or indirectly. My very rough translation, and Trine may disagree on that, is basically singling out. If you can demonstrate ways that you are minimizing that impact, that balancing test may end up with a different result. And technology and privacy enhancing technologies may help with that. You have similar places like, again, the proportionality test, which is based on the social need, and again, are there additional safeguards? And those safeguards can be technical. They can also be legal. But again, even if you have a lawful basis, your processing must be proportionate, and the proportionateness can be impacted by whatever technology you're using. So then again, cryptography comes into play. And there's another one with the, you have this kind of facility in the GDPR where if you had an original purpose for which you were collecting the data and processing it, and then later on you find out that you may need the same data for a different purpose that might violate your your purpose limitation, there is a facility in there that say you can use it for an additional purpose, but there's a kind of a 5-factor balancing test, again, whether the new purpose is compatible with the old one. And again, part of that test is potential for negative impact and the safeguards, and again, technology can be such a safeguard. So in that sense, I usually say GDPR compliance is not so much a point as a process or a vector. You're never really there. And also never trust any vendors that sell you a GDPR compliant product or a product that will make you GDPR compliant, because there's no such thing. At the same time, technology can be helpful for quite a few of these balancing acts inside, and there's quite a variety of these tests in there. And Nick is signaling that I have 5 minutes left for my last 2 slides, so I shall move on. And this is, of course, the kind of bad slides lawyers make. Nonetheless, I'm abusing the bolding feature in PowerPoint for that. There's basically, the GDPR tasks you to design your data processing as privacy by design. At least one of the few times the word privacy is used in the GDPR. It's usually about data protection. But part of that conversation is taking into account the state of the art, the cost of implementation, and the nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, as well as the risks. So you, again, have to balance things and have to make a good risk assessment. And oh, by the way, that is a continuous process, both at the time of the determination of the means for processing and at the time of the processing itself. And then you have to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, again, it depends, such as pseudonymization and data minimization. So again, that is a clear, almost a challenge to any data controller to apply technology to safeguard the interests of not so much their own organization as the people that are involved with the data. And even more concretely is when it gets to information security, there's Article 32. And again, you see the same phrase starting, the art, state of the art, the risk, etc. And it talks about pseudonymization and encryption, and the ability to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience. Then you end up in kind of ISO territory of language where it's about availability, integrity, and confidentiality. And then all of a sudden it sort of ties into a much more technical sphere. So those are the places where it says, basically says, thou shalt use cryptography, but not so much on the how. So that's for me sort of the exceedingly short mise en scène for the following speakers and the panel after that, but there's still some time left, 2 minutes to be exact, for whatever questions or objections I may have been raising.
So what I'm extracting from this is that the law is written to allow quite a lot of interpretation
Yeah.
in terms of what's adequate. Thank you. So it seems like the law is written to allow quite a lot of interpretation in terms of determining like what's an adequate privacy protection. I'm curious, in the context of Europe, is that interpretation done by judges or by law enforcement agencies?
There's an interpretation done by the so-called data protection authorities, which are specific independent regulatory bodies to do so. But for example, when it comes to the adequacy of your measures, these bodies are quite willing to defer to, for example, cybersecurity agencies. And they publish guidance, even though that's not frequently enough and still maybe not concrete enough for practitioners. But there's a long-standing tradition of saying, for example, and then I actually have to move back a little bit, for example, for the special categories of personal data, for example, which are here. Yeah, health data, sexual orientation, ethnicity and stuff like that. Then you must not necessarily adhere to the state of the industry, but the state of the art. So it's on purpose written in a technology-independent way, and also in a contextual way, in the sense that even if you're using the technology that otherwise would be adequate, but your threat environment is changing nature, that in itself creates a different balance in striking the balance between the cost of implementation, the technology available, and the risks. So I would say in the current shift in geopolitical environment, that on its own would warrant under the GDPR a revisiting of a lot of data controllers of what technology they're implementing to affect this. Does this answer your question sufficiently? Yeah.
We've got one more question, and then I propose to go to the next.
Thank you. Kind of going off that, I'm curious. I think a lot of us think in more formal, rigid terms and not legal terms. For this like technical body that interprets these things, for things like in the next slide you call out like encryption and pseudonymization. Like, how prescriptive do they get? Like, can you use like a Caesar cipher and that's encryption and you're fine, or do they have like?
Like I answered to the previous question, the data protection authorities are quite willing to defer to cybersecurity agencies, and for example to ENISA. And I would say Caesar encryption is probably not going to cut it. Neither ROT 13 or other trivial means. And there's actually a growing body of cases of enforcement, especially by the French Data Protection Authority, but also the UK, although it has Brexited, they effectively still have GDPR on the books. And they already clearly have said, for example, in some data breach cases, your data address was not encrypted. And that is simply fundamentally not good enough in your case, and therefore we're going to fine you. It's not prescriptive in the sense you have to do that at minimum, but they use it as a stick to hit clearly easy cases where there was a large data breach and it was very sloppy security by even the most lenient standards.
That makes sense.
Okay, let's thank Walter for this great refresher.
Thank you.